Number 4. The Graf Zeppelin. No German aircraft carrier took part in naval battles during World War II. There were several German battleships, cruisers, destroyers, and U-boats, but there were no flat tops. The Nazis planned to build 4 carriers, but only came close to completing one. Launched in December 1938 under the name KMS Graf Zeppelin, the ship was only 80% finished. It was destined to be scrap metal because of construction delays, an aircraft shortage, and heated arguments between Air Marshal Hermann Göring and the Navy. The keel was laid for the Zeppelin on December 26, 1936, fulfilling a promise made by Hitler to the German Navy. The Zeppelin weighed 19,250 tons and was 920 feet long. It had 1,760 crew members and could store 40 aircraft. When the ship was converted into floating storage for U-boat parts, the Germans had only partially installed the catapults. Hitler's views on the project were inconsistent, and he never gave his full support. Göring was also a strong critic and was angered by any challenge to his authority as commander of the Air Force. Regardless, Hitler gave Göring the go-ahead to start plans for the ship. In response, Göring proposed earlier models of the Messerschmitt 109 fighter and a redesign of the outdated Ju-87 Stuka dive bomber. The 2 aircraft were designed as land-based and were never meant for carrier operations. Even after improvements, they were inferior to their allies. Göring convinced Hitler the planes wouldn't be available until the end of 1944, knowing it would delay the carrier's construction. Göring's strategies were successful, and in 1943, production on the Graf Zeppelin stopped. By the time construction was cancelled, Admiral Karl Dönitz, a submariner, was commanding the German Navy, and all shipbuilding efforts were focused on creating new U-boats. Throughout the rest of the war, the Graf Zeppelin remained at its Stettin moorings and never saw combat. On April 25, 1945, the Zeppelin was scuttled in the low waters off Stettin, which is now Szczecin in Poland. This happened shortly before the Red Army claimed the city. It wasn't prepared for the junkyard, so the ship was refloated by the Russians and hauled to Leningrad full of looted goods and military components for the Soviet Union. The Soviets gave it the moniker PO-101 after its cargo was unloaded. The Graf Zeppelin had one more mission to do since the new owners wanted to repair and refit the ship as a new carrier, but this proved difficult. It was brought out to sea again on August 16, 1947, and Soviet ships and planes used it for target practice. Aerial bombs were dropped on its hangar, flight deck, and smokestack. Then, in an attempt to show how to sink an American-flagged carrier, aircraft and ships fired more rounds at it. The Graf continued to float after 24 strikes before being destroyed by torpedoes. The specifics of the Nazis' intended use of the vessel are now lost to history. The American, British, and Japanese warships gained experience in the years between wars, while the Germans had none. Even though the Zeppelin had cutting-edge features, its creator's lack of understanding was evident. The anti-aircraft weaponry was large but poorly placed on the starboard side, and the massive surface armament had limited value and unnecessary weight. For a fleet carrier designed to work alongside capital ships in the Atlantic commercial lanes, the radius of action was very limited. If the Graf Zeppelin had been there, support missions may have prevented the sinking of the Bismarck, Tirpitz, and other naval conflicts. Since then, the Germans have never operated an aircraft carrier. The wreck was found over 260 feet below the surface, and the Polish Navy started a 2-day survey of the wreckage when it was discovered on July 12, 2006 to determine its historic identity. Using remote-controlled underwater robots, they came to the conclusion that it was indeed the Graf Zeppelin. Have you heard of Graf Zeppelin before this? Let us know in the comments and hit that subscribe button while you're at it. Number 3. Project Blue Book. The United States Air Force conducted a systemic investigation of UFOs between March 1952 and December 17, 1969 under the codename Project Blue Book. Captain Edward J. Ruppelt served as the project's director. It was modeled after similar initiatives like Project Sign from 1947 and Project Grudge from 1948. The main objectives of Project Blue Book were to identify if UFOs posed a threat to national security and to conduct scientific analyses of UFO-related material. Numerous UFO reports were examined, but Project Blue Book was shut down in 1969 as a result of the Condon Report, which claimed that studying UFOs would not lead to any significant scientific breakthroughs. The following are the conclusions drawn from the Air Force's investigations. There was never any evidence presented to or discovered that sightings classified as unidentified represented technological advancements or principles that were outside the realm of scientific understanding. Likewise, there was never any evidence suggesting the sightings classified as unidentified were actually extraterrestrial vehicles. By the time Project Blue Book was finished, it had gathered nearly 12,618 UFO reports. It was determined that the majority of them were misidentifications of natural objects like clouds, stars, or airplanes. According to the National Spy Office, several of the claims could be explained by formerly top-secret reconnaissance aircraft U-2 and A-12. But despite in-depth research, 701 complaints were still labeled unexplainable. The names and other identifying details of witnesses have been removed from the UFO reports, which were stored and later made public thanks to the Freedom of Information Act. Number 2. Project 1794. The Department of Defense released 3 U.S. Navy videos in April 2020 that featured unidentified aerial phenomenon. The videos will probably continue the discussion about what is really out there, but in recent years, declassified documents have made the truth known regarding flying saucers and other objects. One of these so-called flying saucers were clearly from our world, not flown by little green aliens from a far-off planet. It was a component of Project 1794, an effort by the U.S. Air Force to create supersonic aircraft to shoot down Soviet bombers. The Air Force and Avro Aircraft, a Canadian company, worked together in the early 1950s to create an assault craft that was distinct from other jet fighters of that era. It was a vehicle shaped like a saucer instead of the typical wing and fuselage design. Theoretically, the vehicle would have a top speed between Mach 3 and Mach 4, a vertical ceiling beyond 100,000 feet, and a potential range of 1,000 nautical miles. It would use takeoff and landing capabilities, negating the need for runways, and could potentially be deployed almost anywhere according to declassified papers. Aside from being circular, the design would have included built-in stealth features as well. Simply put, it would truly have been something out of this world. The records from the Aeronautical Systems Division of the United States Air Force were made available by the United States National Archives in September 2012. The National Archives claimed that these cutaways have a significant similarity to the flying saucers from popular science fiction films published during the years these reports were made, 1956 and 1957. The issue to raise is whether the AVO Project 1794 was one of the UFOs individuals claimed to have seen in the 1950s. That's doubtful, though. The vehicle in question most likely wasn't capable of what its creators intended. One has to consider the VZ-9 Avro car, a variant saucer that was financed by the U.S. Army, which was looking for a low-flying VTOL plane. The initial specifications for a workable ceiling of 10,000 feet and a top speed of 300 miles per hour. Despite all attempts, the craft could only fly a few feet off the ground at maximum speed of 35 miles per hour. Wind tunnel testing proved the aircraft was aerodynamically unstable and lacked enough control for high-speed flights. The Avro car demonstrated uncontrollable pitch and roll motions while flying higher than 3 feet off the ground. The Army's Avro car was more of a slow-moving hovercraft than a high-flying saucer. After the project was scrapped in 1961, the Canadian company shut its doors a year later. One of the Avro car prototypes is now on exhibit at the National Museum of the United States Air Force in Dayton, Ohio. The U.S. military's attempts to create a flying saucer went horribly wrong. But whether or not the real flying saucers are out there, well, we'll have to wait and see. Number 1. Projecthabakkuk. A secret that once had the potential to alter the outcome of World War II remains hidden under Canada's Lake Patricia. The British had a strange idea: build aircraft carriers out of massive icebergs to gain the upper hand against German U-boats. After all, they were plentiful, free, and thought to be unsinkable. Even though it seemed crazy, Winston Churchill gave his blessing to the project. Parts of a prototype were created and tested at the lake over the course of 4 months and are still there 50 feet below the surface. Projecthabakkuk lives on even though the ice melted. Geoffrey Pike, a scientist working for the British War Office in 1942, attempted to come up with a plan to defend Allied ships in the U-boat Alley, a region of the Atlantic Ocean where Nazi submarines ruled and were out of reach for Allied fighter planes. He believed it would make sense to drag pieces of Arctic ice south so planes could land. This would also save on other important building materials. The International Ice Patrol, which was created to destroy icebergs after the Titanic sank in 1912, reported that breaking them up wasn't easy, even with torpedoes and incendiary bombs. At the time, ice was thought to be practically unsinkable. The prophet Habakkuk, who's quoted in the Bible saying, "Be utterly amazed, for I'm going to do something in your days that you would not believe, even if you were told," inspired Pike to name his ambitious design HMS Habakkuk, which is a misspelling of the old prophet's name. It was as difficult as it sounds to build a battleship out of ice. Since icebergs are 90% buried in the ocean, they would need to have about 500 feet of room above the water to launch aircraft from them. It would be almost impossible to operate such a vessel. Additionally, icebergs' tops melt, which would be problematic for aircraft trying to refuel. Also, a flight deck made of another material was needed for proper takeoff and landings. Because of this, they chose to create a ship with an ice hull that was constructed like a regular vessel and had to be kept frozen using a refrigeration system. The intended warship would be the biggest ever constructed, measuring 2,000 feet long and 200 feet wide, more than twice the size of the Titanic, with room for 300 planes. Churchill would have a secret weapon against the U-boats thanks to this ship, which could travel at a pace of 7 knots and take on waves up to 50 feet high. On December 4, 1942, he gave the proposal his approval in a note marked Most Secret. He requested that a prototype be made. Now that Britain needed ice, it went to Canada for help. The National Research Council was given the task of conducting the experiment, and C.J. Mackenzie, who was in charge, referred to the plan simply as another of those mad, wild schemes. The test was carried out at Lake Patricia in Alberta's Jasper National Park. Nothing about it was ever disclosed to the laborers. They dubbed it Noah's Ark. Despite not knowing what it was, they were aware that it was something related to the war effort. The building of a 60-foot-long prototype ship began in 1943. The walls and flooring were made of wood, tar, refrigeration pipes, and a piece of lake ice. The refrigeration pipe wrapped around it like a rib cage, and the structure resembled a large shoebox with a giant ice cube in the center. The vessel was given a roof to shield it from the weather and give the impression that it was just a boathouse. The prototype was successful, but not easy. Some of the piping was broken upon arrival, so air was pumped through the cooling system instead of water. A superior construction material called picrete from pike and concrete was produced during this time, which meant adding wood pulp to the ice mix. Unfortunately, it wasn't included in the prototype since making it in the massive amounts required for the Habakkuk was impractical. The test revealed that the ice ship was more real than imagined, but the project started to sink by the middle of 1943. A combination of 3 things led to its downfall. First, there was no need for floating aerodomes since Iceland could be utilized as a permanent base in the North Atlantic. Secondly, longer range and newer aircraft were made. Finally, the introduction of cinemetric radar enabled more precise tracking of U-boats. The Allies were beginning to gain the upper hand in the war. These 3 factors rendered it useless before it was ever finished. It was feasible, but not on the scale Churchill desired. The building could have been made, but its implementation would have been difficult. All testing in Canada was stopped in June 1943, and Churchill was notified. After the project was cancelled, the refrigerated equipment was taken out and the model was left in place before sinking down into the lake. Thanks for watching. Which one of these military projects do you find most strange or interesting? Tell us in the comments below and don't forget to subscribe. Thanks again, and we'll see you next time for another amazing video right here on American Eye.